Hello and welcome. This is Mr. Reiner. Today is September 11, 2020, and we are learning about the history of the region of Canada since European contact. Our objectives. Today I will learn about the history of the area of Canada since Europeans came there, so I can understand how migration and settlement changed the area from first European contact to now. I will know I have it when I can tell my friends and family what two European countries fought over Canada the most, and at least two reasons why.
Canada, known for their delicious maple syrup, and being home to nearly all of the greatest hockey players of all time, is the second largest nation on Earth, and with approximately 2 million lakes, contains over 50% of the freshwater lakes on the planet. For many thousands of years, this region was populated with many indigenous tribes of hardy people, capable of overcoming the severe and lengthy winters, thriving and developing unique cultures. The first non-native people to settle in Canada, and the New World in general that we know of for sure, were the Vikings. They built a settlement in Newfoundland around 1000 AD. It is unclear for exactly how long this settlement was occupied for, or if there was more, but ultimately it was either abandoned, pillaged, or its inhabitants succumbed to disease, or assimilated into the local population. But theories abound.
Native Canadians are believed to have migrated from Asian lands about 11,000 years ago. For thousands of years, they hunted on the land, fished in the waters, and gathered wild vegetation. The first Europeans arrived about 1,000 years ago, when Leif Erikson, a Norse seaman, and his crew were blown off course when attempting to sail from Iceland to Greenland. Instead, they wound up on what is today Canada's east coast. It took about 500 years before any more Europeans would arrive. In 1497, and again in 1498, John Cabot, an Italian explorer whose voyages were underwritten by the English government, explored much of the coastal areas of what would someday become Canada and the United States, especially on his second voyage, whose route is shown here. Cabot's exploration party returned to England with glowing reports of rich fishing waters in the western Atlantic. Within a few years, European fishing vessels made yearly voyages to these teeming waters. But it wasn't fish that brought Europeans to the mainland. It was beaver. For in Europe, beaver pelt hats had become all the rage, and the popularity of those hats fostered a large market for beaver fur. To assist fur trappers and traders, the French set to work, building several small colonies in the late 16th century to act as a base for the fur trade.
A bit later, Jacques Cartier, a Frenchman, initiates 2 expeditions and on the day on St. Lawrence, sails into a river. Its name then becomes St. Lawrence River. The interesting part is, since his journey, the territories being colonized by the French start to be called Canada. During the expedition, a local native guiding the French, pointing villages with his finger, saying Canada, which in the Huron-Iroquois language meant a settlement. The name Canada developed from the word Canada.
Samuel de Champlain was a truly remarkable man, and he played such an important role in establishing the first French colonies in North America that he is often called the Father of New France. Champlain was born here in the town of Rouage, on the Atlantic coast of France, around the year 1567, where his father was a sea captain. And so this is where he first learned about sailing and navigation. Champlain moved to Brittany, a coastal area in northern France. And it was here that his uncle got him a job working on a Spanish ship. Thanks to this job, Champlain was able to sail between Spain and its New World colonies several times. Following nearly 3 years at sea, Champlain wrote a book about his experiences. And after that, he was quite eager to start exploring on his own.
So what we have going on here is at the time of exploration, there were lots of people fighting for their religious rights. They wanted freedom, basically. And we're not talking about just in England, like you may have learned already, but all over Europe, there was all kinds of problems because the kings and queens, the leaders of different countries, were not treating their people right, and so they were fighting back, and they wanted to go somewhere where they could be free.
Shortly before Samuel de Champlain's birth, in the year 1564, France had tried to establish a North American colony called Fort Caroline in Florida, but it had been wiped out by the Spanish. And in the decades after that, the wars of religion had prevented the French from exploring and colonizing the New World. However, Spain and England were busy doing both. One of the most famous explorers of that era was England's Sir Francis Drake. From 1577 to 1580, Drake raided Spanish colonies in South America. And then he explored the west coast of North America, trying to see if a northwest passage to Asia could be found from that side of the continent. Then Drake's ship, loaded with enough stolen Spanish gold to keep the government of England running for years, headed back home by sailing all the way around the world. A few years later, here on Roanoke Island, just off the mainland of what is now North Carolina, England tried twice to establish an American colony. However, both of these attempts at colonization ended in failure. And so, by the year 1600, Spanish St. Augustine, Florida, was still the only European colonial settlement within the territory of what is now the United States. Samuel de Champlain's first expedition to North America for France took place 38 years after the destruction of the French colony in Florida. At that time, King Henry IV, the Catholic victor in the wars of religion, ruled France. The king had read Champlain's book about his adventures in the New World and wanted him to join the French expedition. Its goal was to go to Canada and to search once again for a northwest passage to Asia, and also to discover ways that France could tap into the wealth of that distant land, perhaps in the profitable business of fur trading.
So you heard it again, Northwest Passage. What they're talking about here is basically they wanted to find a shortcut to get to Asia, in other words, China by that point, by boat. Because they had to take a long land route all the way from China, and everyone was like, well, there must be some way we can get to China easily with our boats. So they tried to go up north, but it didn't work because there was so much ice, and their boats are made out of wood, so the ice would destroy the boats very easily. Nowadays, we actually can pretty much travel through the northern area of Canada thanks to global warming because ice has melted, so it's easier to go through there. But it also depends on the season, and our boats are stronger too. You know, they're made out of metal. So we don't have to try to find a way that wooden boats can go through it because we have metal boats. We also have to put ourselves in their shoes. There's a whole new world, just like the song. A whole new world out there, and they wanted to go see it. They're so curious. What is there? And what neat things can we find? Just like they were trading China and silk with China, but maybe there are really nice things we can get from North America too. So let's go and let's just see what's there. And they didn't have the concept of borders really in nations like we do today. So they just went to go see what was out there and learn about different plants and animals. And at the time as well, they wanted to get beaver pelts. They wanted to get fish for the people to eat, obviously. They wanted to get wood to build ships, to build houses or whatever it was. So the different things that they were looking for an easier way to get those materials because they had started to use them up or becoming harder and harder to find in Europe. So they're just looking for a new way to find those things. Also, you're going to see 1603. We pronounce that 1603. It's a year. But for some reason, the lady here pronounced it 1603. I think she might be Canadian, so maybe that's the way Canadian people do it. I don't know. So it's a very real possibility that whenever you're an adult, that you will be able to go to the moon or that you'll be able to go to Mars. You know, if you're an astronaut or maybe even as a tourist, you might be able to go to another place. How would you feel, go ahead and type it in the chat, if suddenly you had the ability to go to the moon? Okay? What kind of things would you be interested in? What would you want to see? What would you want to know about the moon? What would you want to do for the first time on the moon? And I'm sure there are some interesting things there, but like some of the things that we did when we went to the moon, because remember, America is the only country that's ever been to the moon so far, but is people actually like hit a golf ball on the moon and took pictures of Earth from the moon, and they dropped a hammer and a feather at the same time, and they both fell at the same time.
Well, in my left hand I have a feather, in my right hand a hammer. And I guess one of the reasons we got here today was because of a gentleman named Galileo a long time ago, who made a rather significant discovery about falling objects in gravity fields. And we thought that where would be a better place to confirm his findings than on the moon. And so we thought we'd try it here for you. The feather happens to be appropriately a falcon feather for our falcon. And I'll drop the two of them here, and hopefully they'll hit the ground at the same time. How about that?
On the moon. So different cool things that they did there, driving the lunar buggy and that kind of stuff. So you can see how anytime you find a new world for the first time is going to be interesting, just because we're human and we're curious to see what's there.
In May of 1603, Champlain's ships entered the St. Lawrence River. And before their expedition ended, they managed to sail far upstream to the rapids that Jacques Cartier had visited 60 years before. It was on the wooded banks of the St. Lawrence River that Champlain formed an alliance with the Algonquin Indians in order to develop the French fur trade. Champlain pledged to help the Algonquins fight their enemies, members of the Iroquois tribes, as well as to supply the Algonquins with French trade goods such as knives and blankets.
So the French especially made deals with the Native Americans that lived there in Canada and wherever else they went in order to trade the fur that they might have or that they would get for the next time the French people come for things they brought from Europe, like maybe spoons and forks or blankets or whatever it was.
And in return, the Algonquins promised to bring the Frenchmen a lot of furs. So Champlain was quite pleased when he returned to France that fall with a valuable cargo of furs. Back in the 1600s, furs were in short supply in Europe, and the demand for them was quite high. People sometimes draped whole animal furs around their necks, while other furs were used in clothing or to make the popular hand warmers called muffs. But the fur of the beaver, which was very plentiful in North America, was useful for another important reason. That was because beaver fur yielded the raw material used to make certain types of hats that were extremely popular back then. They had managed to build a fort at a place they called Port Royal, in a much better location just across the bay. And Port Royal became the capital of the first French colony called Acadia. The year Champlain ended his second expedition in 1607, England founded its very first permanent settlement in North America, called Jamestown, Virginia. It was located halfway between the French settlement at Port Royal in Acadia and the Spanish settlement of St. Augustine in Florida. And within a few years, the English colonists of Jamestown, Virginia, were raising tobacco and exporting it back to Europe for a good profit. Samuel de Champlain's third expedition to North America took place in 1608. The summer of that year once again found the French explorers sailing up the St. Lawrence River. They had journeyed far inland from the Atlantic Ocean, past roaring waterfalls like this one, and past fertile forested land that they could tell would be good for farming once the trees were cleared away. Eventually, they came to a spot where the St. Lawrence River narrows, and where today the city of Quebec rises up on high rocky cliffs. This is the city that Samuel de Champlain founded back in 1608 to be the capital of New France, which was the second French colony established in North America. The first building in Quebec was Champlain's fur trading outpost that is believed to have looked like this. And over time, the city of Quebec grew up all around it. Later on in colonial times, Quebec would have been a very fascinating place to visit. Typically, you might have seen fur traders checking out new canoes, busy shopkeepers selling wooden shoes, soldiers and their cannons, government officials reading royal decrees, and Catholic priests debating the spiritual needs of both the French colonists and the Native Americans. For in New France, Roman Catholicism was the only religion that was permitted, and Protestants were not allowed to settle there. Back in colonial times, ships from Europe sailed up the St. Lawrence River each summer with supplies for the people of Quebec. And the colonists shipped valuable furs back down the river to France. Today, the St. Lawrence River is every bit as important as it was back then, because it is the only route that giant freighter ships can take between the Atlantic Ocean and distant inland ports on the Great Lakes. Interestingly, modern ships follow many of the same routes once taken by the French fur traders in their canoes. And today, after 4 centuries, the city of Quebec is still an important river port. In addition, it is the capital of today's province of Quebec, the only Canadian province where French is still the most commonly spoken language, and where the rich culture and traditions of France are still very much alive. From the time he founded New France in 1608, up until his death in 1635, Samuel de Champlain carefully guided his colony from the city of Quebec. And he made several more voyages to France, trying to gain more support from the king. For during those years, truly incredible changes were taking place in North America, as 4 different European nations competed with one another in founding new colonies and expanding their existing colonies. For example, in 1610, the Spanish founded the city of Santa Fe, New Mexico, far to the south of Quebec, as a way to gain greater control of the land in that region. And that same year, while exploring the icy waters far to the north of Quebec, an expedition led by Henry Hudson claimed most of the territory surrounding Hudson's Bay for England. 10 years later, in 1620, a ship called the Mayflower, carrying a group of English Protestant rebels that we know as the Pilgrims, landed near Cape Cod, in what is today the state of Massachusetts, where they founded the Plymouth Colony, England's second colony in North America. Just 4 years after that, people from Holland began to settle along the Hudson River, in what is today the state of New York, and they called their colony New Netherland. Then in 1629, the Puritans, another English Protestant sect, founded the large Massachusetts Bay Colony near present-day Boston. That year, France and England were at war. English forces captured the city of Quebec and transported Champlain back to Europe. And while Champlain was away, permission for another English colony called Maryland was granted to a Catholic nobleman by the king. But by then, the English had returned the colony of New France to the French. So Champlain sailed back to his beloved Quebec. He immediately got to work restoring the war-damaged city. However, just 2 years later, Champlain fell ill and died. After his death, people marveled at the incredible accomplishments of the man they called the Father of New France, because time and time again, Champlain had risked his life exploring the wilderness of North America, and had written 4 books describing its land and its people. He had mapped the Atlantic coastline from the St. Lawrence River to Cape Cod, had formed long-lasting alliances with Native American tribes, and had seen to it that they were educated about the Catholic faith as well. During his lifetime, Champlain had fought heroic battles, had overseen the development of the French fur trade, and had worked hard fostering the growth of the French colonies in North America.
Just think about that. Isn't that amazing? Before cars or roads or airplanes or helicopters, anything like that, he, with his group of people, obviously, managed to lead expeditions all the way through some of the most rugged wilderness you can possibly imagine. Like, think about it. Do you know anybody in the world who can go through a forest, meet people, you don't even speak their language, somehow communicate with them, trade with them, continue on, discover new types of plants and animals and new lakes and streams and rivers and bays? I mean, it's shocking. There's so many things that this guy accomplished on top of creating brand new cities in a new land. So it really was an amazing achievement that these early explorers did. Like going into nature and exploring it and then coming back alive, then sailing back months to get back to Europe. And then they would come again and again and again. And that's just because they loved North America. They loved exploring something new and making new connections and building a new city and everything like that.
New France, a large area of northeastern North America ruled by the French king, at that time Louis XIII. Louis gave large portions of land in the New World to some members of the French nobility. They, in turn, rented those lands to commoners for a portion of the crops harvested and animals trapped. It was the same system that was used in Europe. France's 17th century adversary, England, especially King Charles II, kept a wary eye on French developments in the New World. The British monarch had his own plans for establishing a presence in North America. In 1670, Charles granted the Hudson's Bay Company exclusive trading rights to all the lands whose rivers and streams drained into Hudson Bay, a huge area,
A cold area.
encompassing hundreds of thousands of square miles. To counter this intrusion, the French and their Indian allies attacked English forts in the Hudson Bay region in the 1680s, but were unable to defeat them. Skirmishes between French and English forces in North America, one of which is shown in this battle map, were seen throughout much of the early 18th century, as the rivalry between the two European powers continued. Finally, large battles broke out in Europe in 1756. Called the 7 Years' War, it covered almost all of the continent and even beyond. In North America, for example, British and French forces fought to gain control of each other's New World lands. In North America, the 7 Years' War was called the French and Indian War. When peace returned to the region in 1763, England, the victor, took over the eastern portion of what would someday become Canada, an area that previously had belonged to France. But the English never insisted that its new citizens of French ancestry adopt English customs. In 1774, in the Quebec Act, England recognized the Roman Catholic Church in North America, to which most French settlers and their descendants belonged. It also established French civil law. Both actions were meant to create goodwill among those of French heritage.
Well, England typically has a bad rap during the colonial times. I mean, we revolted against them, created our own country because of their oppressive regime. But reality is that they actually were pretty free. They were really focused on trade. They had free trade. A lot of other countries would require people to pay like a tax, they called it the tariff, every time that they came into port, which actually hurt their business because England was free, so everyone went there instead, which made them more powerful. And then the same thing with their policies. A lot of it was pretty, you can do whatever you want kind of thing. The problem in the American Revolution was that they were taxing us to control us because we were not doing things as they wanted us to do. But also you have to understand that England is not one term. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of years, and we're talking about multiple kings and queens, multiple leaders. And the other thing is, the king or the queen or whoever it is over in another country. They're not in North America. So they don't really know what's going on. And everything that happens is like what somebody said or what's written down, and it has to be brought by boat to be told to the king or queen before they can make the decision, before that goes back. So a lot of the governing was actually left in control of these governors. And in fact, Canada still has a governor that's appointed. It's actually chosen by the Prime Minister, but approved by the Queen of England. And if the Queen wants, she can actually completely suspend the Canadian government and make a brand new government if she wants to. It's actually the same thing in a lot of different former colonies. Not in America, of course, because we left all that, but Australia, same thing. In fact, it actually happened in Australia back in, I think, the 70s. New Zealand, different places around the world, I think even South Africa. The Queen basically legitimately still has all the power, it's just she never uses all that power.
Even though the British governed these former French lands, many there still kept their ties to French culture, something that lives on to this very day, sometimes militantly. In fact, the differences between those of French and English ancestry have never been completely resolved in Canada. In the 1970s, tensions boiled over when many of French descent wanted the province of Quebec to secede or break away from the rest of Canada. Voters turned down the proposed secession. The attempt to secede was revived several more times. But each time, the efforts have failed. Even so, French became the language of Quebec schools, and French was declared the official language of the province in 1976. Today, Canada is legally bilingual, with both French and English as the country's official languages. However, most Canadians view their history and culture as primarily British. In fact, during the American Revolutionary War against England, Canadians did not support their neighbors to the south. Instead, they stayed loyal to the mother country. Many Americans who remained loyal to England fled to Canada at war's end. They were called United Empire Loyalists. The Loyalists brought to Canada a belief in representative government, for they had lived in areas with colonial legislatures.
In other words, when you say legislature, that just means that they were able to vote their leader, and then the leader was able to vote on laws just like we have today in our government. In the 13 colonies, they had that legislative government, but in Canada, they didn't really have that for a long time, and a lot of that had to do with the fact that Canada was so sparsely populated, which means there weren't very many people that lived there. There were a lot more people that live further down south, and you can probably guess why, because it's a lot warmer. Canada was so cold, not a lot of people wanted to go there. In fact, in the French side of Canada, the French kind of just took a totally different attitude toward this colonization thing, and they would leave. A lot of farmers especially would come from northern France, and they would go to New France. They'd work for maybe about 2 years, save up some money or whatever, just have fun in a new country, and they go back to France. Whereas a lot of the English would actually go and they would stay, and they had no intention of returning back to England for whatever reason.
To keep the Loyalists happy, the British divided Quebec into two parts, one whose population was mostly of French heritage, the other British. Known as Upper and Lower Canada, each had a legislative assembly elected by the people. The assemblies had no real power, however. Canadians and Americans have almost always had friendly relations with each other. The one exception was during the War of 1812, when England's navy stopped and then boarded U.S. ships as the American vessels made their way to France. The French were at war with Great Britain at the time. American sailors were sometimes taken captive to serve on British ships. President James Madison objected to these indignities, and the United States Congress, upon his request, declared war on England. American troops invaded Canadian territory, still under British rule. But when the war ended in 1814, neither side kept any land it had won during the conflict, and relations between Canadians and Americans have been friendly ever since.
At the beginning of the 19th century, population is growing fast. Timber industry becomes more important than trade. Canals are created to move resources. Thanks to sufficient building materials, shipyards are growing. Canada, inspired with the US liberty, starts to voice out demands for democratic reforms. In Upper and Lower Canada, two rebellions break out. The rebels want to overthrow the British and create a republic. They are pacified but give a clear message. The British, who remembered the American Revolution, agree to concessions. Reforms begin and in the end lead to Canadian autonomy. The Act of Union joins Upper and Lower Canada. Responsible government concept forms, and the French and the British Canadians are forced to work together to achieve a mutual goal. The United Kingdom and the US signed the Oregon Treaty, which ends the border disputes. British Columbia and the Vancouver Island become British. Canada finally gains democratic self-government and all its provinces join in one dominion by the name of Canada. Queen Victoria chooses Ottawa for the capital. However, the economic growth is weak. Based on future estimates, until the beginning of the 20th century will grow only 1% per year. Period is close to stagnation. Many Canadians emigrate to the US. The formal rule stays in the hands of the British monarchy. Canadian government sends expeditions up north and creates the Northern Territories. That leads to Red River Rebellion in the areas inhabited by Métis population. The rebellion ends in a deal, and the government creates Manitoba. In the year of 1871, the British Columbia becomes a province. With the expansion of the railways, the end of the 19th century sees economic revival and rapid growth of the population. Immigrants from the UK and Eastern Europe arrive. Vast prairies open for settlement. Canada develops. In 1896 in Klondike, a gold rush breaks out. Yukon Province is established to control the situation. In 1905, Alberta and Saskatchewan joined the Confederacy. The beginning of the century marks an economic boom in Canada. The country becomes the fastest developing country in the world up until the First World War. Being a part of the British Empire as a dominion, English-speaking Canadians see no contradiction in being Canadian and a British at the same time. Canadians are expected to give their lives in the name of the Empire. London is not disappointed. Over 60,000 Canadian soldiers die at Ypres, Somme, and Vimy Ridge. Over 400,000 Canadians fight and about 200,000 is injured. Traumatic experience changes Canada. Some historians call the First World War a bloody tribute for independence, and some a birth of the nation. The casualties make the public opinion see the senselessness of dying for British interests. Trauma starts to make them see themselves as separate from the British. The early interwar period is the time of prosperity and involving consumerism. Canada transmits the first hockey radio edition in history, and in 1923 signs the Halibut Treaty, the first deal with the US, excluding British involvement. However, along the recession and coming of the 30s, Canada faces significant losses in exports. Weakened Great Britain acknowledges the autonomy of its dominions with the Statute of Westminster. However, it keeps its right to change their constitution and establishes an office of the Governor General. Unemployment rate reaches 23%. The price of gas is so high that cars pulled by horses start to appear on the Canadian roads. Around 1939, recession reaches its peak. Second World War erupts and takes around 45,000 of Canadian lives. Canadians take massive losses, and after many years, they will accuse the British of treating their men as a cannon fodder. During the D-Day, Canadians reached the farthest inland positions, and back home, the first socialist government in North America in history comes to power. In 1949, Newfoundland decides to join Canada as the 10th province. After the war, Canada experiences another economic boom. New waves of immigrants come to Canada and diversify its society. In 1960, in Quebec, a quiet revolution takes place. The Liberals bring secularization to education. In 1980, the province of Quebec decides not to become independent, but a year later bans the English language on the road signs. In the year of 1982, Great Britain legislates Canada Act and enables it to make amendments to its constitution. The same year, Canada legislates a new constitution.